Well, hello, you good people. Happy Wednesday. Happy Peikoff Wednesday. It's time once again for me to have the honor of working with my esteemed colleague, James Valliant, on Keeping It Real. Leonard Peikoff's answers two questions from his podcast. James, how are you doing on this fine Wednesday?
I am doing particularly well, and I hope things find you equally well, sir.
They do. They do. We're having some work done around the studio on the HVAC, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. But other than that, and hopefully there won't be any noise in the background. No, there won't. We were just getting estimates. Things are well. Things are well. Things are well in general. There's been all sorts of good news and interesting news, but I don't know, I'm worried about the culture. In fact, I'm worried about penetrating the culture. Hope that doesn't sound too provocative. You have chosen, James, questions on penetrating the culture, questions on having an impact. Where are we at with objectivism? Some of these answers came in around 2012 from Leonard Peikoff, and they apply exactly today in 2023. It's so great to be on the Ayn Rand Center UK channel because if anybody's penetrating the culture, ARCUK, and of course the Ayn Rand Institute, we are making that happen. So thank you for these questions, James. If nobody's sure what kind of penetration we're talking about, I'm going to jump right to question number one. James, Leonard Peikoff was asked on Leonard Peikoff's podcast, and here's a question we've all heard 1,000 times over. Why is Ayn Rand not taken seriously in modern intellectual circles? When the questioner says modern intellectual circles, the first thing I think is what, in Lois Cook's salon? where
Well,
Ellsworth Toohey is hanging out with Gus and Lawrence.
exactly. Yeah, among the fans of the Gallant Gallstone, I don't think we're going to make much penetration.
But those intellectual circles aside, yes, we do need to have an impact. And Leonard Peikoff starts his answer off this way. He says, well, this questioner gives three possibilities. One, modern intellectuals do not understand her philosophy, to which Leonard Peikoff says, I'd say yes, in part that's true, because they have automatized certain falsehoods, which are so much a part of their thinking that anything else seems outlandish. For example, altruism. They can't imagine that any form of egoism could be the essence of ethics, or that values are subjective today. They simply couldn't imagine the alternative. Or if you know the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, again, James, this is Leonard Peikoff answering the question, and are fans of Peikoff Wednesdays and Keeping It Real and Leonard Peikoff's lectures. You and I and Amy Nasir did an episode on the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, and I'm telling you, that is the most popular episode, by far the most popular episode of this series so far. It remains the most popular, well over 1,000 views. I think it was 1,300 the last time I looked, and I love it because
Isn't that ironic, though, that one of the most technical issues in
yeah,
philosophy is the subject of one of our most popular videos, and talk about an effort to penetrate the culture? Yeah. Um,
it's so,
it just
yeah.
to pause you there, Peikoff makes such an outstanding point. Just stop for a minute and think how radical Ayn Rand's ideas are. In calling for a ban on the initiation of force across the board, she's calling for a moral revolution even more profound, if you will, than the assaults on slavery, because it gets to a deeper issue, but it's akin to that. And then if we go to beyond, think of politics, an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism that rejects both arguments on the right and the left. Consider going deeper into ethics. I have a friend who's getting a PhD in philosophy. He hears a presentation. Someone gives a discussion of all the different ethical theories and their problems. And well, what about egoism? The professor says, well, of course, egoism avoids all these problems.
Yeah.
And so he responds, well, why not egoism? And he says, well, egoism just isn't ethics. There's just no way you can be egoistic and be ethical. That's how their mindset is. Selfishness can never, even self-interest put in the most technical way, could never really satisfy them as ethics. Go deeper to the is-ought problem of David Hume. That is an axiom among modern academic philosophers. It unquestionable. You go deeper than that. You go to Descartes and his method of arbitrary possibilities, or the veil of perception shared with Bloch. those are axioms among most philosophers. You can't even question them. Rand's ideas are so radical. It is going to take more than a generation to get penetration in the academic philosophy world of any great significance, in my view, just considering how radical her ideas are and how much of their inertia of the existing mind state that we have to overcome just to get the ideas through. So that's a big,
You
big,
know,
big.
I could do a whole series, and maybe I should. I could do a whole series of shows just on those examples you gave. And it's one of the points that comes out of that. You mentioned the Ayn Rand's point about the initiation of force. It is a profound point. But for Ayn Rand, it's a conclusion. It's not a starting point. There's a whole bunch of people who hear that one profound thing and say, let's start a party, libertarianism. We don't have to go any deeper into all the other stuff. Just that one bit is so profound. But then you went the next level. You mentioned, well, but they can't imagine an ethics of egoism. And I made that point when I reviewed Will MacAskill's latest book on the future and what we owe the future. And MacAskill was asked, well, but what if I don't choose to be altruist? And MacAskill said, you can do that, but then you're just throwing yourself completely out of the realm of ethics. It's altruism or nothing.
They cannot imagine the alternative, an egoistic alternative. They cannot imagine an objective ought from an is. They cannot imagine something other than Descartes' arbitrary approach to knowledge. It's really built in, and you have to overcome all.
Yes.
They have to, if I can quote Yoda, they have to unlearn much that they have learned and learn deep, and that, frankly, their professional colleagues expect of them, which makes it all the harder for them to challenge it, even if they have doubts in their own head as to the bizarre orthodoxy they keep spreading.
Now, in contrast to that, occasionally on the social networks, we'll run into fans of Ayn Rand, even folks who regard themselves as objectivists, who seem to have maybe not the deepest understanding of these ideas. And we think, are there a bunch of objectivists who don't really get it? And then I see that the most popular show, most popular episode in our series is folks who wanted to know more about the analytic synthetic dichotomy. And I take great solace in knowing, no, most of the objectivists out there, they are serious about ideas. Otherwise, why would 1,300 people watch that episode? So it was great to hear Leonard Peikoff say, if you know the analytic synthetic dichotomy, sentences that you validate just by manipulating words and sentences that you validate by observing facts. And, as soon as you start to argue with those people, as I have, the first sentence out of their mouths is, well, is that analytic or synthetic? So they can't understand what you say.
Right.
That's part of it. Now, that's just the first part that he mentions, but yes, those ideas are out there.
We speak a foreign language. That is a really good analogy. And, much of the time I spend in explaining objectivism to people is a matter of translation. It really, really is. Even if they, at the end of the day, have the kind of active mind that can absorb the ideas. It's just a different language. They've never heard ideas this radical before. That's really it.
Yeah. Sometimes I think the argument from intimidation is in some cases, it's almost innocent. When people say, well, surely you don't believe in egoism, it's not just that they're trying to intimidate, although all too often it is that they're just trying to intimidate you, but just some of them, it's just blowing their mind. You surely can't believe that there's any union between the Platonic and real life, between the analytic and the synthetic.
The perfection is possible.
Yes.
So things like that. Absolutely. People who come up with these bizarre things like, well, you don't want the robber barons to be in charge, do you? Whoa, think of all the conceptual things you have to tear apart there for them to grasp that confusion. It's a huge, huge task of education that we have ahead of us if we really hope to make a dent in the culture.
Yes. Yeah, we should have Sean Albert on talk about the robber barons one of these times. We will do that. But Leonard Peikoff mentions the second possibility to explain this phenomenon of why modern intellectual circles don't seem to take Ayn Rand seriously. He says, possibility number 2, they choose not to understand. And I say in part, that is definitely true. Ayn Rand is not part of the pack. She is not recognized as part of the clique, the elite. A lot of them laugh at her, and therefore they don't want to get involved in their ideas. What if they were tempted? Well, what if they laughed at us too? What if they're looked at, or excuse me, yeah, what if they're looked at as kooks or weirdos? It's all too unquote, all too easy to just play it safe. Let me do what everybody else is doing. I think for myself, I might get called out. I might get made fun of. We can't have that. And then his possibility number 3 is that they do understand her all too well. And I say yes to that again, because they grasp enough to know that this is a threat to their status. If she is going to be recognized as a philosophy, well, then their linguistic byplay is not. I think all 3 possibilities are true, and I wouldn't choose one as stronger than the other. Unquote, what I love about that answer is he takes all 3 of those seriously. It's sometimes we're a little too quick to jump on, oh yeah, they're all evil, they're all charlatans, they're all power lusters, and that is out there. But the bigger issue I think that we face on the Ayn Rand Center UK, at the Ayn Rand Institute, as fans of Ayn Rand, as explicit objectivists, these people really believe this stuff. They really believe the wrong things. And with that in mind, because we're on the Ayn Rand Center UK channel, I want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I hope you're supporting the ARCUK. UK. You can do that by becoming a member at aynrandcenter.co.uk. The link is right at the top of the chat if you're watching live on YouTube right now. Become a member, sign up for £9.99 a month. You could become a silver level member, get access to all sorts of goodies that, the non-members don't have. But seriously, support the organization. There are 4 membership levels. And if you put in a super chat right now, go into the chat, hit the $sign, add a couple dollars to your comments so they stand out. That money also supports the Ayn Rand Center UK, makes shows like this possible, and all of the other content. James, you have been doing a lot of great work on the channel lately. More and more on the daily objective, as well as these Wednesday shows and your study group sessions on the weekends. You have been doing so much for the ARC UK and really outstanding work.
Well, I'm hoping, for my own selfish sake, to penetrate the culture. And I can think of no better way to help penetrate the culture than to help Ayn Rand Center UK. We're creating a worldwide community of students of objectivism and opening up a discussion, an important discussion about these ideas that is a prerequisite to that kind of hardcore education that needs to happen, that difficult hill we need to climb. But it's climbed one step at a time, and every dollar you contribute to ARC UK helps us take one of those steps. So please, please do consider becoming a member, subscriber. I think we're doing good work here, and your help is what makes it possible.
Excellent. And whether you're supporting ARC UK financially or not, we do love seeing you in the chat. But we've got a couple super chats that stand out. Adherent of Lady Columbia is in with a big super chat and says, I've noticed this during my watching of New Ideal and Ayn Rand Center UK. Older objectivists seem to be more personable. Is there a noticeable difference between different generations of objectivists? Yeah, yes and no. I think that there's a certain kind of wisdom and benevolence that comes from having lived with these ideas for 30, 40 years. But some of the young people I see coming up are just awesome. Their energy, their enthusiasm, and they're gracious. They're, not everybody, but a lot.
Well, I have to make a confession here. Had you known me 30 years ago,
Yes.
you might, well, let me put it this way. I have close friends who've described me in nice terms as a fire hose. And I think that there is a tendency among young objectivists to become, when they're excited and they get it, and they really get it, they're absolutely convinced in their optimism, like I was, that all I had to do was just make this argument, convince this person, I'll be able to reach this person, almost as though I was ignoring their context or their free will. If I could just make this argument this clearly to them, they can't miss it. And so it turned me into this giant fire hose of activity, enthusiasm, and in some contexts, a little too demanding of other people, a little too unappreciative of their own personal context and their arc of discovery. I think over the years I have calmed down and I've tamed myself. And so if there is a demeanor difference between younger and older objectivists or students of objectivism, I would say it comes with the territory of maturity. I've learned to appreciate the process and individual context in a way that I did not when I was in my 20s. And that's just simply, it's a point of objectivism that I've grasped better because I've seen it in reality. My experience with people over the years, over the decades, has informed this more laid back attitude. This is me laid, yes, folks, this is me laid back. 30, 40 years ago, I was a fire hose of these ideas, and I would have taken on anyone on a subway car who would have challenged them. So maybe it's just a function of maturity.
Yeah, I think so. But I love that Leonard Peikoff mentions all three possibilities, that yes, there's innocent and honest error because there's the ideas. And then there are the people who are afraid. And then there are the power lusters who say, no, we've got to protect our game here. And
Right.
all three of those are real. So if there are young people who think,
Yeah, during Ayn Rand's own lifetime, there were critics who I can say fit to that third category, and there's really no other way to explain their vicious, dishonest criticism of Ayn Rand. They knew better. They knew better, and there's really no excuse.
right,
Let me contrast it, say, with Professor Sidney Hook was Leonard Peikoff's dissertation advisor at NYU, getting his PhD. He wrote monstrously stupid. I mean, he's one of the leading academic philosophers in America at the time. He wrote a monstrously stupid review for the New Intellectual. Now, with him, I think he just simply couldn't understand. I honestly think that he was so brainwashed, so conditioned by his teachers, like John Dewey at Columbia University, that he was unable to him, Ayn Rand wasn't even philosophy. To him, it was just, again, it's like a foreign language. There were others out there, I won't name them by name, but who could have, should have, and seemed to know better, and they were just vicious in trying to get people not to read Ayn Rand. So yeah, both of those other categories definitely do exist and have existed among the critics of Ayn Rand.
excellent. Now we have another super chat from Catherine. And Catherine says, sorry, couldn't be here for a few weeks. Missed you both. Well, thank you for that, Catherine. Thank you for your super chat, which supports the ARCUK and makes your comments stand out, which is well worth the price. But I tell you, I took 10 days off too. So James, you had to hold the fort without me, for example. So yes, I missed everybody as well. And this question has a second part. Our question number 2, the same questioner went on. Said, well, how would you account for the growing respect she's getting among some philosophers and some scholars, as well as for the increased interest in her ideas and the respect that her work is getting? And when I read that initially, I thought, well, is it growing? Is she getting it? But then I remember, Tara Smith and Greg Salmieri and Robert Mayhew and C. Bradley Thompson. And there are so many objectivist intellectuals in the universities now.
Whoa, we have PhDs and professors in every field, not just the humanities, multiple professors in every field in the humanities, like philosophy and history. Oh my gosh, but in the sciences, in psychology, in you name it, we've got professors, PhDs. Some of these people have risen to the very height of academic achievement. The late Professor Alan Gotthelf was surely the world's leading academic authority on the science of Aristotle. Or take Professor Edwin Locke. He's the most widely cited academic in the field of motivational psychology. These people have reached the pinnacle of academic achievement, some of them. Tara Smith, who you mentioned, her book on Ayn Rand's normative ethics, published by Cambridge University Press. Look at Robert Mayhew contributing to the Harvard Loeb series on Aristotle. There is no doubt that there has been a real, modest, I grant you, but a real penetration into academic circles. And more than that, in artistic circles, you can hear casual references to Ayn Rand in popular culture more and more and more. You can hear politicians who don't understand the first thing about Ayn Rand's philosophy trying to glom on to her popularity by saying, oh yeah, I like Ayn Rand. And of course, their politics completely contradicts it. But notice that they're having to tip their hat to Ayn Rand's popularity. They wouldn't say that at all if there wasn't a group of people out there who they believe would positively respond to a positive mention of Ayn Rand. So that in itself, whatever the stupidity, ignorance of the politician, that in itself is a barometer of how they have to take her into account. So I definitely agree with the second question. We have made, given, and in the context of how radical Ayn Rand's ideas are, what an assault to these people's way of living and their way of thinking this is, how radical a thing it is. We have made remarkable progress, and that's the donut, not the hole, that we need to focus on, I think.
Yes, yes. And though the question specifically asking about academic circles, as you discussed, even outside of academia, it's been interesting to have kind of star players out there, names that have national scope. People like Adam Mossoff on intellectual property, or Alex Epstein on energy and energy policy. And entertainers like Mark Pellegrino on the ARCUK, or Rucka Ali doing satire, but also talking about objectivist ideas. So yes, it's been pretty exciting to, as the questioner says, growing respect and a little more scope. So Leonard Peikoff answered that and said, I think you're right, and I think it's good to point that out. This is not all philosophers or even all intellectuals. I think the growing respect, to the extent it exists, comes partly from heroic individuals like Tara Smith and Robert Mayhew and others who have academic positions and have distinguished themselves to such an extent. And I love that he makes that point. These people are so good they can't be ignored. He says, to that extent that people in the department can't avoid noticing that here are objectivists, their students are appearing at different universities at the graduate level, and so on. Some of them, some of these people who are more honest, are shaken up by that. They don't necessarily agree. In fact, the ones who respect Ayn Rand to some extent, as far as I know, totally disagree, even though they respect her. But they've gotten to the point of thinking that so many intelligent people are interested in this, there must be something to it. And close quote, Leonard Peikoff. When I read that, I thought, yeah, you can't deny the intelligence, just the intelligence of listening to somebody like, and unfortunately some of the people who aren't with us any longer, but John David Lewis and John Ridpath, just the intelligence just is, and current intellectuals.
If I hear a lecture by Greg Salmieri on philosophy, I know I'm going to learn something. If I hear a lecture on literature by Lisa Van Dam, I know she's going to reach into my chest and tear my heart right out of my chest. I know that these people will have an effect on me, and I can only imagine what the effect of that kind of brilliance is on someone who, is not as familiar with objectivism. Yeah. And I'd even say the inverse is true about the hysteria of the criticism. It was so much of the attack on Ayn Rand was over the top. I mean, she was compared to Nazis, communists, you name it. She was one critic, literally, a critic from the early 60s said, for Miss Rand, well poisoning is among the kindlier arts, if I'm getting the quote correctly.
Yeah.
It's like she advocates eating babies for breakfast. When I was a young student of objectivism and I read those critiques, they only encouraged me to read Ayn Rand. How could you be so over the top? Could it be that, could she have sold 1 million copies of her book and still be an advocate of eating babies for breakfast? There's just no way. And then when I would read even just a little clip or a description, I would say, that doesn't seem to match. And there seems to be a huge contrast here. So even the critics, in their being so over the top in their attacks on Ayn Rand, I think for the better minds, for the more original and daring and active minds, the critiques themselves can help stimulate an interest in Ayn Rand. They sure did for me.
Yeah. I can imagine. I remember reading early in Ayn Rand. I didn't see the criticisms ahead of time, but where's the sections where like she's, to the gas chambers go? Where the characters of Ayn Rand? I'm just not seeing them in there. And Leonard Peikoff says, I've had my book Opar used as a textbook by people who are totally hostile to it, but who felt that there's enough interest in this that they've just got to include it. They don't agree, but they remember this: the younger ones displace the older ones. The younger they are, and the more they've been brought up from college, for instance, the Ayn Rand Institute programs, the more receptive they are to new ideas. Leonard Peikoff says, I think the old generation is dead, with the occasional exception, but there are always the younger ones coming up. So there's hope there. I was answering for the majority of the establishment. Now, he wrote this or said this in March of 2008. But as I say, I think that list of intellectuals just continues to grow. Yes, we've lost a few of them, but the list keeps growing.
It does. And he makes a really interesting point there about the book being used by teachers who don't agree with objectivism, but are using it to teach objectivism. Wow, that is a real indicator of making progress. When people who are not objectivists are having to use it in order to teach objectivist ideas, then you know we're really making progress.
Yes.
And in this context, I'd like to add another thing. Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff used to say, I forget the exact percentage now, but they said, we don't need to take over academia. We don't need to take over the culture. I forget the percentage they gave, but if we only had like a 5 or 10% representation, that would be it. We'd conquer the world. If we could just get a small percentage of fair representation of her ideas, those ideas have such enormous power that at that point, yeah, the culture's cooked and we're on our way to a much, much better world. Even with just a small but noticeable voice out there in the culture, in academia, and we will conquer as a valve.
Well, if it's going to happen, the first place we're going to see it's going to be in Austin, Texas. They're taking over there.
Yes. My goodness, yes.
What a temptation it has been to move to Austin just to be around both the intellectuals and just the good people that are there.
Well, Kirk Barber the other day boasted that he, at his most recent meeting of objectivists in Austin, had 50 or more people there at one meeting. That's a good local meetup group.
It's like having it's like the mini cons that have been thrown. It's like having a mini con every month.
Right.
So good. Keeping one eye on the chat because I love to see an active chat. And Lee is in with a super chat, £5 and says, thank you, gents. James, off topic. Oh, I don't even know what this means. Maybe you do. James, off topic. Was Reuben Hurricane Carter technically exonerated in 85, or is this an assumption because he was released? Do you know who Reuben Hurricane Carter was?
It doesn't come to mind. I may know it with some more facts. If in the regular chat you want to kind of remind me of what the case is, the name sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm sorry, I don't remember any of the facts there.
Well, I know you know more about criminal justice than I'll ever forget, but I haven't heard that name before. So yeah, maybe Lee can let us know. There's also a comment in the regular chat because Evil Tiki 13 says maybe the train scene from Atlas Shrugged. And I've heard that before. People who said, yeah, Ayn Rand was terrible because she killed all those people in the train. Well, it's a work of fiction, first of all. She didn't kill anybody. It's a scene in a book. And second of all, they seem to take the implication that Ayn Rand thought those people deserved to die, which is so obviously not the point. The point is that by unleashing irrationality in the world, those kind of disasters will happen, and that there wasn't a person on the train who didn't hold to the irrational ideas. It was more suicide than it was anything else. So yes, I have heard that before, but I almost love it when people bring it up because it's such an example of how wrong that criticism is.
So when a novelist depicts the natural consequences of evil and the death that will result from that, it's the author's fault for pointing out the cause and effect between the evil and the deadly consequences. No, Ayn Rand opposed the ideas that led to that evil consequence. She did not want that to happen. She's begging and pleading the reader not to let this train disaster happen. But then in looking in the minds of the passengers, she's saying, well, it's the entire culture that sort of necessitates these things happening, whether the people on the train know it or not. And that was what Ayn Rand always used to say. Philosophy governs history. It governs the world around you, just as it governs your own psychology. And that's the point that she's making. Be attentive to the philosophical ideas that you accept, because whether you know it or not, they could have a suicidal consequence to you. Far from being cruel, it's compassion.
Yes.
And if you can't see the compassion in that, the horror of that tragedy is trying to get you to feel compassionate enough to say that ideas matter. Wow, what an upside down way of looking at that scene, huh?
I can hear the critics, though, saying, well, you people of ability could make altruism and self-sacrifice work if you wanted to. You know,
No.
you'll do something.
Yeah, yeah, you'll have the answer, Mr. Reardon. Yeah, no, 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 no. Um,
Yeah, yes. So let me jump to question number 3, since we're at the bottom of the hour. We've got another half to go here. Is it time-consuming and difficult work to get a solid grasp of objectivism? Or excuse me, it is time-consuming and difficult work to get a grasp of objectivism. I think I need new reading glasses. And the questioner asks, will this change if and when the culture improves? Or will it always be difficult to learn? And Dr. Peikoff here, of course, has a great answer. I would say it will be easier in many respects, although parts of philosophy are difficult, especially epistemology and the foundations of ethics. I found those two the most complex and the most time consuming. And if you're going to understand them in detail and in a reality oriented way, well, those are not going to be easy. But everything in philosophy will be easier in a better society. And then the questioner went on to say, well, if it will become easier, why? And Leonard Peikoff says, well, the questioner lists a number of factors, all of which I agree with. Children being inculcated with rationality from the start, not having to overcome rationalism, having abundant cultural data that makes it easier and more natural to induce the right principles, not having to overcome wrong views that have become inculcated and automatized, such as religion and altruism. All of this is true, plus, Leonard Peikoff wraps up this way, not having been told that abstractions are detached from reality, and that to be practical, you have to be concrete bound. Above all, because the root of making any thought difficult is the college professors who wage war on your crippled mind. Without them, let alone with their replacement by rational men, it will become much easier to learn anything, including chemistry. He gives the example of a concrete. Yes, can you imagine being brought up in a world where, and I wouldn't have even thought of this until he answered it that way, abstractions and concretes were not completely separated. Thought and action, reality and ideals.
Religion does that. Religion does that. It separates the real from the ideal, theory from practice, mind from body. The minute you postulate a supernatural dimension. So religion completely destroys a mind and it's the correct approach to knowledge and ethics. Completely. It's not about this world. It's not about happiness here on earth. Now, on the one hand, that sounds like the most natural idea possible. Egoism will come naturally when properly explained to people. And in fact, it's more consistent with reality and your success and your happiness. When we get over that, paranoia about the word selfishness and the concept of egoism, it will be much easier to understand ethics than it is, say, some detached from this world religious ethics. But even worse than religion are when better minds turn to academia for better answers, and they're told effectively the same thing. The mind is impotent. Egoism is wrong. So you go to your college professors to escape the popular religion at the time, and you're being told the same darn ideas because these people have the same damn mindset, only in a much more sophisticated, Ellsworth, Toohey, Kant-informed kind of way, which really stacks the deck against us in a certain way. But on the other hand, we've got reality on our side. When we do penetrate through those assumptions that a lot of people have just inculcated and built into themselves, there are aspects of objectivism. Let me put it this way. What Ayn Rand called philosophy for Reardon is
Yes.
a lot easier to digest when it's objectivism. Objectivism is so much it conforms to your observation. It conforms to reason. It conforms to reality. So in one sense, and it's more conducive to your happiness and success in life. In one sense, it'll be a whole lot easier to convince people on the level of philosophy for Reardon with objectivism than it was with any of these other bizarre departures from the truth and supernatural ventures or skeptical ventures of the mind that these um, erroneous thinkers have sort of built into us. So on the other hand, there is still philosophy for Ragnar. And there are technical issues in philosophy. There really are. And Dr. Peikoff points out the foundations of ethics, and especially in the field of epistemology, there are some highly complex issues. Philosophy will always be a topic that requires experts and people who devote themselves to its detailed technical understanding. So you can't have one without the other. But on the other hand, the basics of objectivism for the ordinary person, it's a lot easier to live and understand than all the other philosophies that have been proposed in human history. I can promise you that.
Excellent. Well, that'll take us into the fifth question, which is the third part of this. But real quick, before I get there, Lee did clarify that Reuben Carter was the middleweight boxer who was twice charged with a triple murder in Paterson in '67. He's the subject of a famous Bob Dylan song called Hurricane.
Oh, that reminds me of the story. I still don't have all the facts, so I can't really answer the question. But at
Okay.
least at least he jogged a general memory in me, but unfortunately not a sufficient memory in me to give a meaningful answer to your question about your legal question there. I'm sorry, I do need a little preparation for a question of that kind. It was kind of off
Yeah.
topic, but
Yeah,
thank
you
you
would
for your interest.
need to know the details of why he was released if you're going to judge whether that was an exoneration.
Yeah.
Interesting question. Now I'm gonna have to look it up afterward and get
Yeah,
more
now
information
he's
about
got me
that.
looking it up. Right?
And sorry we don't have a better answer, but thank you for supporting the ARCUK, and we'll see what we can do. We also have a super chat in from Wes Stewart, a generous one, and he says, just growing up in a secular family made it much easier for me to get objectivism. I just had to get over the default altruism I had absorbed from the culture. Religion is poison to the mind. Well, you, James, with a copy of Creating Christ behind you there, I'm going to guess you agree with Wes Stewart in that regard.
I will have only one word. Amen.
Perfect. A perfect answer. So thank you very much for that, Wes. And thank you for your support as well. And then this questioner went on. Even in Utopia, well, Utopia is a bit strong, but he says, even in Utopia, will Ayn Rand's statement, now I've never heard of this before I read this question, will Ayn Rand's statement that no man can be a true philosopher before the age of 40, will that statement still be true? And Leonard Peikoff says, yes, I would say so, because a true philosopher is not a rationalist. That means he has to acquire his abstractions from his experience or the experience of others that he understands. He needs, therefore, a vast knowledge of particulars, of the world, of people, of history, of various forms of thought, in order then to stand back, see what is in common, see how these ideas are interrelated, and finally reach a set of universal principles tied to reality, which would be a philosophy. This is a complex, time-consuming matter of intellectual growth, which I do not think can be done by anyone, however precocious, in their teens or 20s. It can be undertaken in one's late 20s, I think, or even in the early 20s, but it will take a long time to really be at home in it. Now, he says a bit more there, but it's interesting. When I was young, I used to do some writing, short stories, and I had a friend of mine who was serious about writing fiction. And my mother, my dear mother, Mother's Day is coming up. Happy Mother's Day, Mom, said something that seemed like a bit of a slap across the face, but it was really that kind of slap that gets you back to reality. She said, I don't think you can write great fiction until you've been out in the world, until you've done things. And we were young and we hadn't traveled much, and we were just kids, teenagers. And when I read this answer, I think, oh my gosh, that takes me right back to that uncomfortable truth, which is, and not to say that if you're young, you should be humble or regard yourself as naive, but just realize how much you've got to learn, not learn, but just experience in the world. So I love that Leonard Peikoff says, you've kind of got to be a little bit older and having taken in a lot of the world if you're going to be a true philosopher, not a rationalist.
Coming full circle back around to what I said earlier about myself. I
Yes.
was in my 20s because I really hadn't integrated even what philosophy I was learning then. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was a smart young man. I got a degree in philosophy from New York University, magna cum laude, thank you. And in my early 20s, I graduated. And believe me, philosophy I hadn't truly absorbed even the philosophy I'd been taught. I obviously was still insecure. I was obviously still not completely integrated with it. And that's precisely why I was such a fire hose. And think of all the lessons about human nature that I still had to learn in order to correctly aim the hose and tune down the intensity. Now, I know that's me, and to bring up Ayn Rand next is I do not mean to compare myself, because Ayn Rand was doing in her 20s some remarkably original thinking, but even Ayn Rand was still learning. I want to urge people to read the journals of Ayn Rand, and I would particularly point them to her earliest philosophical notes in English. She was still in her 20s when she wrote them, And she starts out, these are the beginnings of an amateur philosopher. But in those first notes, we can see that so much of objectivism is already nascent in her mind. She believes in the absolutism of reality. She believes in Aristotelian logic. She believes that ethics can be a matter of principle and reason. She believes that emotions basically have a cognitive basis. She rejects determinism. There's so much of objectivism that seems to be already implicit, but she's asking questions in her own mind about those things. She's not really got her full answer, certainly not the formulation for her full answer. Now, I would also point out that she wrote The Fountainhead when she was in her 30s. The Fountainhead was published when she was, 38 years old. And so one could be a philosopher on the scale of The Fountainhead before the age of 40, but you have to be a genius like Ayn Rand. But notice even there, Ayn Rand wasn't done with her major philosophical discoveries. In the late 1940s, it was in fact around the age of 40, circa 1945, when she began to think about Atlas Shrugged, and she began to write her first serious proposed nonfiction book, The Moral Basis of Individualism. And it was in the process of starting Atlas Shrugged and planning that she began to develop some of the formulations that she would become very, very famous for in Atlas Shrugged and in her essays in the 1960s, her nonfiction work in the 1960s. In the 1940s, that's when she discovered her theory of concept formation. So it was about the age of 40 when even Ayn Rand was having some of her greatest philosophical insights. Although if you are a genius, you might be able to do it in your mid-30s like she did The Fountainhead. So she may be a bit of an exception as a genius, but even she was doing some of her greatest philosophical discovering at around the age of 40 or so.
That it's great that you brought up The Fountainhead, because I know that after completing The Fountainhead and having the idea for The Strike, she thought, well, now that I've done this, the next book will be easy. And, it'll take years, but, a couple years.
A couple of years. Knock this thing out.
And just doing the big speech in the book ended up taking 2 years.
2 years.
And if you study the speech in the book,
the better part of 2 years just on Galt's speech.
Yeah.
Wow.
People think, oh, yeah, Ayn Rand, she was objectivism from day one. Yes, she was an objectivist. She's somebody who lived her ideas from day one. But as far as becoming a philosopher in the sense Leonard Peikoff's talking about here, 2 years just to write that. But on the other hand, when it was reproduced in For the New Intellectual, what was the subtitle? The title of that section was, "This is John Galt speaking." The subtitle was, "This is the Philosophy of Objectivism." And if you read Galt's speech, yes, she never finished the moral basis of individualism. She presented the whole philosophy in that speech. It's a real stunner if you take it not just as a great academic climax, but as an intellectual work.
Right. Well, in the spoiler alert, in the story of Atlas Shrugged, it is the discovery of a new morality that's part of the story. And so Galt's speech, people think, oh, this is distract. No, no, no. It's a major plot element. It's what the plot is building to and sort of follows from when he gives this speech. But it's astonishing, all the major ideas of objectivism and in their integrated organization are presented in that speech. Her formulations are just exact and precise and help you integrate each of her basic ideas with the rest so that you can see how the whole philosophy comes together. That kind of achievement, I think, does require a mature mind. And that kind of achievement requires a mature genius, frankly. So I could never have done it, even after I turned 40 or 50, I can tell you that.
Yeah, I think of some historical figures who achieved great things when they were very young. Those might be the exceptions. People
Right.
who could be philosophers at some level in their teens or 20s. The mind of a Mozart who is already writing brilliant things.
You'll notice where those prodigies come from.
Mhm.
Mathematics, chess, music. When it comes to things like poetry and philosophy, the great works are usually the product of their maturity.
Oh, that's a great point. You're right. If it requires a broad range of abstractions, then it's going to take time. And you're right. If you're starting with abstractions, if you're studying mathematics, even studying music, it is interesting too, though, because I think the passions run deeper as the musicians get older. Mozart was brilliant, but sometimes I think it goes only so deep, and you have to get into an older Beethoven. You have to get into an older musician to really have the richness.
Mozart's most creative work was at the end of his life in his late 30s. And he was then, knocking on the door of the Romantic Revolution in music with that. He was starting a revolution in music, or at least knocking on the door of it by the time he was in his late 30s. But he was mathematically and organizationally and harmonically a genius when he was practically a child, certainly by the time he was a teen.
Yeah, and none of this is to suggest, again, that anybody in their teens or 20s and interested in these ideas should have any amount of modesty or humility. Absolutely not. I give myself a lot of credit for what I did when I was young, but Leonard Peikoff is right to say, and here's the end of his answer, you have to, in effect, program your mental computer with a mass of data. And it's not GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. It's TITO, truth in, truth out. That truth must not be floating abstractions, but concretes that you know and that are real to you. I don't see that a man can get the breadth and perspective on the whole in a reality-oriented way in less than a couple of decades. Close quote, Leonard Peikoff.
The questions of philosophy, I don't think are even real to someone until they've had a couple of decades on this planet. I mean, in my own mind, it was hard for me as a teenager to even fully understand the question, much less approach an answer to that question. Whereas by the time I was in my 20s, at least I could dimly start to understand questions. I still had massive questions. I still had massive points that I needed to integrate into it. Frankly, I'm still learning, of course. I'm still a student of objectivism. But the point is that when I was a young man, I had to get to the point where I could even understand the questions when they're philosophical questions. And I think that's true for most people.
Yes, yes. It is a philosophy for living on Earth, and it takes a whole lot of living on Earth to make it real to oneself.
Right, right.
Well, James, I appreciate this conversation because, again, I have enormous admiration for young people who are just getting involved in these ideas, or older people who found them later in life. But I also appreciate the richness of that journey, watching that young enthusiasm, even the folks who say, now that I know these ideas, I know everybody's evil and you're all wrong and you're all idiots. Better people will get, I totally get it. So the better people will get over that hump. The fire hoses out there will eventually become watering cans, and we'll start growing the garden of intellectuals that we have. And I especially appreciated any chance to just remind myself, there's so many good intellectuals out there, so many good people in objectivism. And, James, yourself, and Mark and Jonathan and all of the hosts on the Ayn Rand Center UK, and all of the intellectuals in the universities and in the other professions, as you say, the psychologists, people like Ellen Kenner, who've been doing this now for 15, 20 years and have been a voice and doing podcasts and putting it all out there, and people involved with government, people like Alex Epstein and Adam Mossoff, who are sitting before the House of Representatives and letting them know, no, here's the rational way to look at the environment or property rights. I think there is enormous cause for optimism, and also, it kind of gives us, the rest of us, an idea of what we're doing.
Before we reach that critical mass, when we can see the actual influence of objectivism on the culture, it's going to be disheartening. It will be. And, we'll see around us things getting worse and worse and worse. But during that process, things will, under the surface, be getting better as we grow and our ideas penetrate and our numbers increase. We will grow and grow. And when that critical mass happens, it will be as if there was a sudden dam break, and things, I think, will rush down, carrying all kinds of water downhill very, very rapidly. So let's keep working for that day when critical mass is achieved, because when we do achieve it, I think the change will be sudden, radical, and far easier than we expect when we turn that corner. Until then, it may be the hardest thing that we have to work against is the discouragement of not making any seeming progress, as all the progress is subsurface, if that makes any sense. So
It does.
I would encourage my friends out there not to get disappointed, not to get disheartened, not to lose faith in reality or reason. And I don't mean faith in the negative sense there, confidence in their own mind, right? The knowledge that they are the ones connected to reality, because we are making progress, even if it's not visible in politics or in popular culture, at least widely in popular culture. But as you point out, look at all the psychotherapists and psychotheorists we have out there. Look at all the artists we have, from music to the visual arts to poetry. I mean, I can't even count on my hands the number of novelists and poets that I know who are deeply influenced by Ayn Rand. And as those numbers grow, we will have an impact on the culture. We will. And when critical mass happens, it will be a whole new day, a whole new dawn will arrive, and we'll be surprised at just how quickly good things will happen. Promise.
I agree 102%. And the reason I say that extra 2% is because I'm thinking I need to put a big poster on the studio wall here where I can put, because I leave names out. And then afterward, I think, why didn't I mention Gina Gorlin and the work that she's doing in entrepreneurial psychology and the work that she's done with the Intellect group and interviewing people like Steven Pinker? And why didn't I mention, of course, I leave names out because there's too many. There's too many names, too many good people in objectivism right now doing outstanding work. And if you needed more reasons for optimism, or at least to maintain good cheer, the Daily Objective is coming up in an hour. Jonathan Hoenig has has spoken about this question of the head or the heart. As objectivists, we think, oh, we know the answer to all of those dichotomies, but Jonathan has interesting things to say about that. You need to listen to him in an hour on the Daily Objective. And then later today, Lee Pearson is back. Dr. Pearson is back, and they are going to do the question. If you know Lee Pearson, you know the answer, but you want to hear what he has to say about it. Are we getting close to AGI, artificial general intelligence? I know that Dr. Pearson will say no, but there are good reasons to say yes, too, because it's a question of how you define your terms. I want to hear that. He always does a good Clubhouse session afterwards that you can participate in, too. So definitely get on with that. Thursday Collective is coming up tomorrow. TV Talk on Friday. They're going to be discussing the updated Lost in Space. Next week, Harry Binswanger is doing another Ask Harry Anything. Those are some of his best episodes. So much good stuff coming up. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. James, thank you for your insights on Leonard Peikoff's outstanding answers to these questions and keeping it real. And I look forward to doing this all over again next Wednesday. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.